Hello, I'm Sean Lim, and welcome to After 10. The world's largest fund dedicated to battling climate change opened right here in Korea this week. On today's After 10, we learn more about the Green Climate Fund's role in protecting the future of our environment. Stay with us. The headquarters of the UN Green Climate Fund was established in Songdo on December 4th.
녹색기후기금은 개도국에 대한 특별한 지원이 필요하다는 국제사회의 공감대를 바탕으로 탄생했습니다.
Many major global figures, including the heads of international organizations, joined the opening ceremony, reflecting Korea's increased national status, along with the level of support the world has for the Korean government. The Green Climate Fund is the so-called World Bank of the environmental field, and advanced nations have agreed to raise climate finances of $100 billion by 2020. Korea promised financial assistance of $40 million after establishing the headquarters of the Green Climate Fund. Korea has taken a leading role in dealing with climate change, along with its establishment of the headquarters of the Green Climate Fund. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to visit us here at After 10, and congratulations on the establishment of the GCF.
Thank you very much for having me.
So for our viewers who might not be familiar with the Green Climate Fund, what does it do, how is it established, and what is its main role as the world's largest funder of these climate change projects?
GCF is designed to help developing countries to address the climate change. They're in two areas, in mitigation of the greenhouse gas emissions and adaptations to challenges from climate change. As you know, climate change is a common threat facing mankind. It's not an issue of tomorrow, it's an issue of today. Over the past 20 years, international society tried to reduce greenhouse gas emission in international society. But despite the efforts of the international society to increase financing for those climate-related challenges, still, the needs and infrastructure needs resulting from those climate change is well above the expectation we have. Therefore, there is a necessity for the international world to create new financial institutions to address those climate change, which will help developing countries. In this context, in 2010, Cancun, Conference of Parties on United Nations on Climate Change Conventions, they decided to create a new body named Green Climate Funds, and over the last 2 years, there's substantial efforts are made to create the GCF, and then we finally have GCF on December 4th in Korea. We are hosting, and we have opening ceremony of the headquarters of the GCF.
So the GCF came from the United Nations, and in particular the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. So what was discussed at that meeting? What was the agenda mainly about?
COP19, which was held in Warsaw, Poland, I think last November. There was discussion on, of course, negotiation on to what extent we can achieve a target of reducing greenhouse gas emission. But at the same time, as a core issue of this COP meeting, climate finance was discussed between member countries. When it comes to climate finance, Korea, from the beginning of this meeting, Korea make a proposal to facilitate the discussion between developing and developed countries concerning climate finance. And Korea made a proposal to create working groups, high-level working groups consisting of the policy makers and experts to expedite the discussion on climate finance. And finally, some part of our suggestion was accepted, and COP decision includes the creation of the workshop to discuss climate finance and also allow to have biannual ministerial dialogue on climate finance. Concerning GCF per se, Korea made a proposal to speed up the discussion on business model of GCF. Based upon the completion of business model, we ask all member countries to agree on the prepare resource mobilization before the next COP, which is December 2014. So I think there's a good progress from the discussions. And I hope that next year's UN Climate Summit in September will be a very important political momentum to speed up, to strengthen the discussion on how to finance climate change and how to helping developing countries that help them to reach an agreement on reduction target on greenhouse gas emissions.
So at the grand opening this week of the GCF, we were visited by Jim Kim from the World Bank, Christine Lagarde from the International Monetary Fund. What's the interest in the GCF from such two large international organizations?
I think that Jim Kim, the president of World Bank, once mentions in this several times that without adequately addressing climate change, it will be very difficult to end poverty, to ensure shared prosperity, which is the main goal of the World Bank Group. Therefore, World Bank has a lot of emphasis on climate change and try to streamline climate change in their development projects. At the same time, IMF, as one of the institutions, is in charge of macroeconomic policy and fiscal conditions. They realize that phasing out fossil fuel subsidies and getting carbon pricing right is very important, ensuring efficient resource allocation and also improving their fiscal balance, thereby helping countries to adapt to climate change. Therefore, it's not a coincidence from our point of view for those sister institutions to come to Korea to congratulate the birth of the GCF, as climate finance is in the core of the development, in the core of the macroeconomic policy in many countries.
So are the IMF and World Bank going to be funding the GCF? What's their involvement going to be?
I think that they're not funding GCF, but I think that given the recognition of the international society, GCF will be a main financial channel to address climate change, to help developing countries to address climate change. Therefore, a lot of money will go into GCF when it comes to climate change projects. Indeed, World Bank, a lot of development project is related to the climate change. So maybe over the coming years, if GCF have sufficient funding for resource mobilization, and some part of money will go through World Bank to do actual projects in the green field.
So it's going from the GCF to the IMF, GCF to the World Bank for the projects they're working on related to climate change in developing countries.
In our view, focusing on World Bank first, I think that, for example, GCF is supposed to cover the work from capacity building or helping countries develop their national plans, and also implementing large infrastructure projects, and also getting private capital from the private markets to finance the infrastructure projects. So in our view, World Bank and GCF can make a joint capacity building, technical assistance to developing countries to draw their national plans to addressing the climate change. But also they can make a joint implementation of those large projects. They're co-funded project by GCF or at the same time by the World Bank. So there are a number of ways and options are possible, open to collaborate between two institutions. So you can cover from capacity building to implementation. I think there are a number of areas for the cooperation. When it comes to IMF, it's not a real cooperation in terms of project, but IMF, there are a number of ways to address climate change. Carbon pricing is the one example. And you can get revenue from the carbon pricing and use that revenue to assist countries to adjust to climate change. So in the case of IMF, they're proposing some harmonization of the policies concerning carbon pricing, and phasing out fuel subsidy will be also consistent with the reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So there are different way of collaborations. We envisage different way of collaboration between IMF and GCF, but they're in the same vein and the same goal, pursuing greener growth and cleaner technologies.
So the goal is by 2020 to finance at least $100 billion a year in climate change projects. Isn't that a lot of money?
Let me clear on these issues. There are a lot of confusion and discussions, but what we understand from our experience of participating in the meeting, COP and GCF board meetings, there is a clear agreement that there will be annually $100 billion will be funded and financed by GCF for the projects related to the climate finance, at least starting from 2020. But it doesn't mean that we're going to have 100 million every year. So for the time being, the agreement is that we already spent $10 billion every year from 2010 to 2012. And then we're going to spend another $10 billion from 2013 to 2015. But there's no explicit agreements how much you spend, how international society will spend between 2016 to 2018. 2019. It's a blank. But the bottom line is that by 2020.
So President Park has actively promoted the creative economy and getting involved in creating new vehicles to tackle climate change. Mm-hmm. What has the Korean government already been doing that aligns with the goals of the GCF and the issues that the GCF is facing?
Yeah. Our President Park made an opening speech, and he explicitly mentioned that she thinks regards climate change and responding to climate change as a part of the core agenda of the creative economy. So in the area, for example, in the area of the new energy management system and renewable energy management and carbon pricing, carbon capture and storing, there are a number of areas. The Korean government will make a lot of investment in terms of R&D to improve our capacity to deal with the climate change. So that kind of businesses and investment will create the new markets. So it's basically inconsistent with the creative economy. So creating new markets, creating new jobs. So this is the way we look at the GCF and responding to climate change. And it's very consistent with the concept of creative economy in this administration.
So this administration supports climate change projects and the GCF. How will the GCF support the Korean economy and the government?
I think it's very early to say about those contributions, but one of the meaning of the hosting GCF is that hosting of GCF will naturally give rise to the development of our capacities in the business of climate change and greenhouse gas emissions, thereby elevating our capacity to deal with things. So when GCF is actually making investment, doing infrastructure projects in developing countries, our presence in the G20 summit in St. Petersburg in last September, she emphasized the importance of GCF in tackling climate change, and we are able to achieving the outcome in terms of leaders' communique, explicit communique, supporting the argument that all G20 member countries support the operation of GCF as soon as possible. And also bilaterally, there's a bilateral summit meeting between Korea and United States. There's explicit mentioning of strong support for the GCF operations. And also recent visit of our president to Europe, there's a strong communique reflects especially between Korea and United European Unions, Korea and England. There's explicit phrase to support the operation and resource mobilization of the GCF. The resource mobilization is new language. So I guess the now international community, in part thanks to our presence and our administration's continuous efforts to raise the awareness of the importance of GCF, they now understand and accept some our language concerning the supporting the GCF. At the same time, in our financial minister, our financial minister, the APEC finance ministry meeting also expressed same concern. We got support from the member countries, and we are able to incorporate strong support of GCF in the language of the ministerial communique. So in this way, we try to do bilaterally, multilaterally, to convince international society the importance and urgency of the climate change and importance of GCF as a vehicle, financial vehicle to dealing with the climate change.
We also have the Global Green Growth Institute. And how does the GCF work with the GGGI?
Yes, GGGI is the international organization that is designed to help developing countries to develop their national strategy for green growth. So, and then it was transformed into international organization last year. Given that GCF is a number of experience and rich experience in dealing with those development strategies for the many of developing countries, I think there is ample room for GCF incorporate, especially in the early stage of capacity building. For example, GCF and GGI can make a joint technical assistance in terms of making national plans for developing countries, in terms of green growth, in terms of climate change. But at the same time, if GGI has a very attractive, very reliable business plans, or the national strategy is very good, I think, then GCF can fund those projects that is initiated by GGGI. But we have to see. Korea as one of the board members of GCF, will do our best to bridge these two different institutions to get a synergy effect.
We saw Climate Finance Week this week as well.
Yes.
What was that all about?
Yes, we decided to declare, Korean Ministry of Finance and our government decided to declare the first week of December, when our opening ceremony of GCF headquarters took place, as Climate Finance Week. On the sidelines, and we're holding two international events on climate finance. And the main motivation to declare Climate Finance Week is to provide a very creative and favorable environments for the successful launch of GCF, as we invite very high-level important figures from international organizations and governments and all embassies. So this is good momentum for them to understand the importance of GCF. At the same time, we use Climate Finance Week as a way of raising the awareness of the serious of the resource mobilization in GCF. And also we believe that this is a good opportunity to make Songdo and Korea as important global center, global hub for discussion on climate finance.
And we had a chance to speak with the first executive director of the GCF, Hella Shekurohu, at the opening ceremony. So let's take a listen to see what she had to say.
The Green Climate Fund today has commemorated the inauguration of its headquarters here in Songdo. So I am very pleased that this is an important step in the operationalization of the fund. I feel, as executive director of the Secretariat of the Fund, the significant responsibility, but also the opportunity to make a difference, given the importance of this institution. It is actually quite significant that the headquarters of this new multilateral global financing institution dedicated to financing the response to climate change is headquartered in Korea. Typically, for such institutions, the country that hosts, it has a very significant meaning. Similarly, we have the World Bank is hosted by the US, Asian Bank by the Philippines. It really sends a signal, and in this case, I think the signal that it sends is that the Korean example is one which is very helpful for us to see how to combine successful economic growth, prosperity, job creation, along with a creative way of developing on a low emission and carbon resilient way. And I think the words of President Park this morning were in that regard, saying that climate change is not a problem of the future. It is here, and we have to use our creativity to respond to it. So the near future is very concretely to complete all the requirements for us to receive, manage, program, and disperse financial resources. The next two board meetings in February and in May will be focusing on completing these. First, we will be meeting in Bali in February And then in May, hopefully, we would hold the board meeting in Songdo. And those two important meetings of the board will be incredibly important because that is where these 42 countries represented in my board through 24 seats will be agreeing on the final policy framework for the fund. And after that, 3 months later, if we complete these requirements, we can go to our initial resource mobilization.
In 2020, after the Green Climate Fund has been endowed with all of its financing, what kind of projects can we expect to see?
I think that's the main motivation to establish GCF is serving two purposes, mitigation and adaptation. So I think that the first step will be engaging in mitigation project, which means that reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So we can think about alternative source of power plants using alternative source of energies. Or at the same time, we can talk about adaptation projects, which means that how can we make ourselves safe from the disasters and climate change-driven disasters. So we can think about big infrastructure like dams, big infrastructure like transportation, urban development, because a lot of climate problem comes from the urban congested areas. So I think that there are big projects out there, and they're going to help developing countries to tackle this problem.
What kind of changes can we expect to see from the international community?
I think that establishment of GCF is very, very significant and symbolic. In terms of negotiation, I guess that it's a flip side of the coin. Negotiation and finance is a flip side of the coin because one of the motivations to establish GCF is to helping developing countries to adjust to the climate change. That happened because that in the course of the discussion on how we can reach agreement of reduction target on greenhouse gas emission, developing countries said that it's a historically responsible issues and the developed countries should make a voluntary reduction on their targets. At the same time, provide money to developing countries. So I think that in order to reach agreements on reduction targets involving developing and also developed countries, it's very important to provide financial support for those developing countries so that they can commit themselves to the targets. Therefore, I think this is a very strong momentum. So I think over the course of the year, when the funding comes in, I think there's a natural incentive. It's a preconditions for developing countries sitting at the table and accepting those targets and the commitments. At the same time, in terms of climate finance, so far there's no specific, there are some small adaptation or small environmental funds, but the size is very small. Their objective is not clearly defined. It's not really focused on climate change. So in the absence of the clear financial vehicle, it's very difficult to scale up the finance of the climate areas. Because as I mentioned, the required finance is very huge compared to a typical development project. So creating a GCF as a main financing vehicle for climate change, I guess that will help all international community to scale up the climate finance in preparation of the 2015 negotiation on climate change.
All right, well, it looks like it's off to a great start. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for your time.
And that does it for us here on After 10. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you next time.